Hello, and welcome to Badger Talks Live, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Chandler Meyer, originally from Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Horticulture, studying plant breeding and plant genetics. I am pleased to introduce Irwin Goldman, my advisor and professor of horticulture in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Today, Irwin will be discussing the practice of plant breeding and the selection of improved crops for Wisconsin farmers, gardeners, and consumers, and the work that his UW-Madison team has done in the area. Since 1992, Irwin has been teaching courses in plant breeding, vegetable crops, plants and human well-being, food and seed sovereignty, and evolutionary biology. His program focuses on breeding and genetics of table beet, carrot, and onion. Inbred lines, populations, and cultivars released from the breeding program are used around the world by farmers, gardeners, and plant breeders. So please welcome Irwin Goldman.
Thanks so much, Chandler, and it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you about our work in plant breeding. And I would love it if you had questions and comments, if you'd enter them into the chat, and we can go to those as soon as the presentation is done. So I just want to start by saying I think one of the great strengths of Wisconsin's agriculture is its diversity, and this diversity of products and cropping systems and markets and opportunities is one of the things that's kept Wisconsin vibrant and successful for more than 150 years. I also think that one of the great strengths of our country is its diversity. And the fact that so many people from so many lands could come together and bring their traditions and their ingenuity and their hard work has elevated our vibrancy as a country and our productivity. And I'm always inspired by the words on the Statue of Liberty: give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. My grandparents were immigrants, and I have no trouble imagining a long line of immigrants with their luggage and their traditional customs and foods waiting to come into the country. And Europeans who settled here did bring their foods with them. And in particular, they brought their vegetables, their simple, staple, reliable vegetables upon which they had used for many, many centuries. You don't really have to stretch much to consider that simple root vegetables, like you see here in this picture, in this beautiful drawing by Van Gogh, characterize the diet of some of our European settlers to Wisconsin. And here, one of the ways that this manifested was in vegetable canning, among other things. Many towns had canning plants and they preserved fruits and vegetables. This became a cornerstone of our agricultural practices. And so pictures like this are things that we've seen around Wisconsin for well over 120, 130 years. And here's a wonderful one of the West Salem Canning Company more than 100 years ago. This has also led to Wisconsin being one of the top vegetable processing states in the country. In fact, we're number 2 in area harvested, in the area of utilized production, and the value of that production. Now, admittedly, we're a distant second to California, but nevertheless, we are still one of the top states in the country for the production of processed vegetables. Now, that's not to say that that's all we do. In fact, we are a state where you can also see vegetables at the farmers market, around thousands of farmers markets around Wisconsin. And of course, home gardening is also incredibly popular in Wisconsin. And so we have lots of different ways that vegetables make their way to consumers, to grocery stores, and are part of what farmers and gardeners do this time of year. Well, the college where I work, the UW-Madison, and particularly the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, has long been home to a cohort of scientists whose mission it has been to improve and advance vegetable crops. And this started in the 19th century, but began to take its modern shape in the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century, when plant breeders started to use the new science of genetics to develop improved crops. So the development of hybrid corn and productive strains of alfalfa, and of course, staples like peas and cabbage and sweet corn and cranberries and tomatoes and potatoes all followed. And you can find evidence of this on our campus. There's a sign right outside of the building where I work talking about genetically superior crops that were developed at UW-Madison beginning in the 1930s. And so this has been something we've been at for a very, very long time. Now, starting just after World War II, Warren Goldman arrived in Madison. He's my predecessor, and he actually turns 100 on April 18th. But he began breeding beets and carrots and onions in Wisconsin 71 years ago. And it is his program and his work that I continue that I'm going to talk about in my presentation today and share with you about how that work is going. But before I talk about the breeding itself, I just want to say that I and my colleagues are also involved in a lot of other activities on campus that hopefully contribute to the bigger picture of what we're talking about. So I'm involved in teaching students, for example. That's a big part of what I do, teaching formal classes, teaching workshops. I'm also involved in training scientists. And this picture is me with 5 other young scientists who have all studied at the UW-Madison and taken part in our research programs and are now working in some capacity in the industry, in the agricultural industries. I also, like many of my colleagues, do research, and we write papers and hopefully create new knowledge that's useful to the world. And finally, provide service. And this is a picture of some recent field days where we're showing different varieties of carrots and talking with farmers and other people in the seed industry. So our work encompasses the service, the teaching, the research, as well as the plant breeding. So let's move to the subject of plant breeding and talk a little bit about what it is that we do. And this is a field that is both ancient and modern at the same time. I say ancient because humans originally domesticated wild plants and they turned them into edible crops. And I think this is beautifully depicted by this image from John Dobley, who's in our Department of Genetics. And you can see the ear of hard teosinte corn, the ancestor of corn on the left, and one of the early strains of corn, probably that's still maybe 5,000 years old or so, 4,000 years old on the right. And so you can see the transformation that took place over many thousands of years as farmers selected for palatability, for productivity, for adaptation, and for the traits that made our modern crops. So this is quite an astounding achievement. And I say that plant breeding it's not only critical for feeding the people who populated our planet, but it's going to be increasingly important for feeding the people who are going to be living on our planet. In 2050, we anticipate nearly 10 billion people, with 70% of them living in urban areas. And it's going to take at least 70% more food than what we are producing right now in order to feed these people. So plant breeding becomes one of the ways we can increase the productivity and the quality and hopefully the value of the food that we grow. And so, the way I think about it, and I realize this might be a bit of a self-centered view as a plant breeder, but next time you're, well, maybe today when you're sitting down to eat dinner, think about thanking a plant breeder, or maybe you could say a farmer. Especially a farmer who was involved in the domestication of wild carrot on the left into cultivated carrot on the right. That transformation involves selection, it involves genetics, it involves many, many generations. And it's this kind of work that I'm involved in and that I'm going to talk about here with you. So let me just first say that the vegetable crops that Wisconsin was canning and that we all depend on as gardeners and what our farmers depend on, most of these vegetable crops were domesticated elsewhere. Beets, for example, came from the Mediterranean. Carrots and onions come from the mountains of Central Asia. And these crops all came to this country with settlers, many of them in this case, European settlers. So as we grow these crops here, and as these crops became in demand, they faced their own challenges. This is a picture of me holding a leaf of a beet plant last year, and I was looking at these lesions that are forming on the leaf. And as a plant breeder, one of the things that I want to do is to select varieties that farmers and gardeners can use that will not be susceptible to disease, that will be able to grow well in Wisconsin, and that will be productive and something that's sustainable essentially for food production. So to do that, I enter into the process of plant breeding. And plant breeding is very much a kind of long-term project. And if I could encapsulate that in one slide, it would be this. I find an objective that I want to breed for. Like, for example, I want to breed leaves that aren't susceptible to that disease, that bacterial disease. I'm going to choose parents that will be good parents to cross for my breeding program, and I'll generate genetic variation by crossing those two parents together in a very traditional way. And then I'll select the best progeny, and I'll repeat that crossing scheme 5, 6, 7, 8 times. Maybe it will take me 8, 9, 10 years in order to find progeny that are resistant. I'll test them on different farms around the state of Wisconsin and hopefully release something new. So I might start with the crossing section. Here's a picture of me in a greenhouse crossing 2 beet plants together that I put underneath a paper bag. I've chosen those 2 parents because I thought they had good qualities and I wanted to mix the genes of the 2 parents together. Then I would grow rows of these progeny out in the field. And here is a picture of me in Randolph, Wisconsin on a muck farm. I'm looking at seedlings of onions here and I'm evaluating them. And I'm going to choose the onions that are the best and advance those to cross for the next generation. And so there's a lot of work in the field looking at the crop. Then there's a lot of work to harvest. This is Emily Galke, one of our students. She's harvesting here Swiss chard and table beets from some plots. And as you can imagine, there's a tremendous amount of physical work associated with plant breeding, which is actually one of the things I love most about it, because to be able to work hard outside is a true joy. Then you have to taste it. And this is a picture of me and Chandler tasting some beets. And you could see that I think I probably didn't like this one so much. I have kind of a look on my face that I don't know if this one was very good. But we do a lot of tasting in the field to determine what's going to advance to the next generation. Once we choose them, we bring them back to Madison. We plant them in pots in the greenhouse. And you can see these beets here. They're growing in the greenhouse in the winter, and they're going to send up a flower stalk. And then I'm going to be able to make crosses during the winter and get seed in time for May to plant them out in the field again. And this is what our greenhouse might look like, where we have cages made of cloth that are containing the plants that are being pollinated. The long-term goal of this, of course, is to develop a new variety. And here is a variety that we developed in our program. This variety took about 16 years to develop, if you can imagine that. It's being, I have a picture of it here, being sold at a grocery store in New York State. And it is a variety called Badger Flame. It's a variety we developed. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that because it was a project that has some really interesting plant breeding related stories in it. But it is a long-term prospect to start with an idea and end up with a variety. So that's why I call plant breeding kind of the slowest and maybe even the least recognizable of the performing arts. It is a not immediate gratification, right? Like a performer in a concert, but rather one that is more contemplative and slow to bring about success. And as a way of illustrating that, I can show you what I looked like at the very beginning of my plant breeding activities. This is what I looked like kind of in the middle of my plant breeding activities. And this is what I'm predicting I'm going to look like when I'm done with my plant breeding activities. And I'll tell you, it has been, even though it does take a long time to do this work, it is an incredible joy to be part of the cycle of breeding and the cycle of the seasons every generation. So I want to give a few examples here of the work that we do, and maybe stimulate some questions and some comments from you that we can talk about shortly. So one of the main things that plant breeders are trying to do is to improve the crop, improve the strain. Maybe they're trying to make it higher yielding. Maybe they're trying to make it disease resistant. Maybe they're trying to improve the flavor. Here's an example of carrots that we developed. The carrot on the right is a carrot that is susceptible to a disease called aster yellows, which, as you can see, is a pretty unattractive carrot. The aster yellows causes this profusion of crown shoots in the carrot and these hairy roots. And it occurs in Wisconsin a very high frequency. And so we began selecting for resistance to this disease and created carrots that are pictured on the left here that are pretty tolerant to resistant to aster yellows. This means that a farmer could grow these carrots, the resistant carrots, without having to worry about the disease, without having to spray an insecticide, because this particular disease is carried by a leafhopper. And so one way to control it in a garden or on a farm would be to spray to control the leafhopper. Here, one might be able to grow the resistant variety and not have to deal with that. Another example is onions that are early maturing. And if you look at this onion field, you'll see a plot of onions that's 4 rows wide in the middle there. And you can see that the tops of those onions have gone down. When we say onions are maturing, we say they go tops down. And as the tops go down, the bulbs mature. And you'll notice these 4 rows have gone tops down long before the rest of that field is ready. This was an experimental onion we developed that matures about a month earlier than your typical onion grown in Wisconsin. Now, it's a bit smaller, but it would allow a gardener or a farmer to get a crop in early if they wanted to. And so this is the kind of thing that we might do for a climate like Wisconsin, where sometimes our season can be quite short. The way it works in our system is that we breed these new strains and then we turn them over. Usually the university licenses them to the seed industry. And here's a picture from a seed catalog. If you went to a seed catalog and you bought some carrot seeds or some beet seeds or some onion seeds, it's possible that those varieties that you're buying to grow in your garden or if you're a farmer, to grow on your farm, were made by crossing with the material that came from our breeding program. And so one of the ways we measure our impact and success is the extent to which the seed industry uses these to make new varieties. And so it's always exciting for us when a farmer or a gardener says, oh, I grew this variety. And then we can say, you know what, we had a hand in breeding the material that went into that variety. And so in this way, we're connected to the consumer and we're connected to the farmer. I want to tell you a bit of a story here about beets, and this relates to the Badger Flame variety that I mentioned earlier. Beets, a lot of people know them as a canned vegetable, and a lot of people don't like them as a canned vegetable, in part because beets are earthy. Some people say eating beets is like licking a playground or eating dirt. It tastes like soil. And in fact, beets are the only vegetable that I know of that have their own board game in which the objective of the game is to give away all of your beets. That's how you win the game, right? So that tells you something about this vegetable. So I was very interested in this because I love beets. Actually, I like the earthiness and I'm not bothered by it at all. But I know that some people are. And I became really interested in this in the early 90s when I started my work here. Martha Stewart, the famous Martha Stewart, was talking about in her work sort of rediscovering the beauty of these old root vegetables like turnips and parsnips and beets. And she would come up with creative ways to cook them, including one of the sort of iconic dishes, the beet and goat cheese and walnut salad, which is something that she promoted. And it sort of created a bit of a renaissance in beets in the mid 90s. You saw all of a sudden beets popping up on menus and people talking about beets. And this was almost a sort of reintroduction of beets into our culinary traditions. People talked about the earthy flavors, but they found new ways to mix them. Wolfgang Puck, a famous chef, also did a dish like that became very popular, where it was beets and kind of certain types of cheese and nuts, and these combinations have sort of made it popular again to think about the vegetable. We've also seen a proliferation of fresh, peeled, cooked products in the marketplace, and you can usually find Love Beets, which is a U.S. company selling this product in the grocery stores around Wisconsin and around the country. So beets did have a bit of they had a moment in the last, let's say 20, 25 years or so. But but we became aware of people's concerns about them having to do with their earthiness. And it turns out that the earthiness in beets is due to a molecule called geosmin. And geosmin is pictured here. It's a simple organic molecule, and it's the same compound that exists in soil. So when you go out to your garden this spring and you put your shovel in the soil and you turn over the soil, you get that incredible whiff of earth. That is what you're smelling, is geosmin. And it comes from Streptomyces bacteria that live in your soil. Well, it turns out, for reasons that we don't fully understand, beets and spinach and Swiss chard and some other foods produce their own geosmin. They produce earthiness. They make earthy scent. And so the beet actually came by its earthiness in an honest way. It produces it itself. And so we actually became interested in this. We said, all right, if beets make their own earthiness, could we reduce it through breeding? Could we make a beet that's a little less beety? And that might attract consumers who would be interested in a sweet kind of root vegetable. And so that project started, I want to say, about 1994, 1995, and it was very importantly inspired by my friend and colleague Nick Breitbach, who's now retired from the university, but was really an inspiration to help work on this project and to make the crosses and do the work. And here's a picture of Nick in the greenhouse. Well, there's a long story to the development of it, but let's fast forward to about 2012, 2013, to the creation of Badger Flame. And this is a beet that was selected for low levels of earthiness and also low levels of oxalic acid, which gives a kind of astringent taste to the beet. And one of the things we were trying to do here was create a beet that you could essentially eat raw. You could eat this raw. You could eat it just like a sweet, crunchy root vegetable. And that's really what it is. It's striped red and orange, or orange and yellow, depending on how you look at it and depending on the season. And it's sweet and crunchy and non-earthy. And people have been able to use it in all sorts of interesting ways. And in essence, it's created a kind of a separate category of beet, one that doesn't need to be cooked. It certainly can be. It can be pickled, it can be canned, but it can be eaten fresh. And so breeding was sort of our ticket to doing this. We now have continued that work through the use of some fairly sophisticated laboratory analysis. We use a gas chromatograph and we use a special technique because we can measure the amount of geosmin in a single beet. And so we can use that information to select beets that are very high in geosmin, if you like earthiness, or very low in geosmin. And here's a picture of some of our beets that are being sampled in the lab. And there's a picture on the right of the actual gas chromatograph. And over the years, over the last 12 years or so, we've had a number of students from all over be involved in these projects. This is one of them. Her name is Lynn Mayer. She's now a carrot breeder in Idaho with Bijou Seed Company. But she's kneeling in front of her populations that she selected to be both high and low in geosmin. Now, one of the things about this work, I think it goes without saying, but you'll appreciate this, is that you get dirty doing this work. And this is a picture of us, some of our group, one of the beet harvest days. And it's part of the joy of doing this work is getting your hands in the soil of Wisconsin. Well, I'll just show you this picture. We don't have enough time to show lots of data, but this is the work of Lynn Mayer, and it shows that beets can be selected for very high amounts of earthiness. We can increase geosmin by 75% or more, but we can decrease geosmin by 75% or more. So we can make a beet that's really beety, and we can make a beet that's really non-beety, and different consumers like different types. And so this is one of the things that we've been able to use in our breeding program, is that information. And these are 5 varieties that have just been released from our program in the last year, bred by Solveig Hansen, who's pictured in the lower right here. She's currently working as a postdoc at the University of British Columbia, but she developed these 5 different varieties: Moving Target, Blushing Not Bashful, Snow Globe, Evansville Orbit and Evansville Ember, specifically for their culinary properties. Some of them very earthy, some of them not earthy, some of them very sweet, some of them not so sweet. And breeding was our way to develop essentially a specific flavor profile vegetables. I want to give you one more example before I stop here. And this involves our techniques in breeding. And Chandler, who introduced me, is working on a project that relates to improving our ability to do breeding itself, to improve our efficiencies. And this example that I'm going to give you here is another one along those lines. And it's the work of Christy Angelo, who was a graduate student in our program and who's now a sweet corn breeder in Plover, Wisconsin with Illinois Foundation Seed. When we breed a crop like beets or carrots or onions, one of the first things that you realize is that it's a biennial. It takes 2 full years to complete its life cycle. Most people don't know that. Most people don't know what the second part of the life cycle of an onion is. In fact, if you planted an onion this spring in your garden, an onion bulb, it would flower and send up a flowering stalk that looks like this. That's why it takes 2 full years to go through one single generation of onions. And if you want to breed a new onion variety, that can easily take you 20 years to do. So going through the cycle of onion farming or gardening or breeding, we would start with seedlings that we would grow in one season. And at the end of the season, we would harvest bulbs. Those bulbs then need to be stored in cold temperature. And they need to be stored for months in cold temperature before they can be actually planted the next year. During that cold storage, the bulbs are dormant, and that dormancy can last for months. During that dormancy, those bulbs also need to be subjected to cold temperatures, kind of like a winter, in order to flower and set seed the next year. And that's what a biennial is. And so in that second year, the onion breeder will have to plant the bulbs, get them to flower, and you can see them flowering here, and then put cages over them and put flies into those cages to let the onions pollinate and make seed. And this is what you're going for in that second year. So Chris, in thinking about this project, Chris's goal was to try to make onion breeding more efficient. 2 years per generation means that you could spend your entire career breeding 1 or maybe 2 new varieties of onion. So Chris developed a technique to break the dormancy of the onion bulb. And that involved cutting the top of the onion bulb off, soaking the bulb in hydrogen peroxide for 4 hours, and then planting the onion in the greenhouse in order to get it to grow. Here's a picture of Chris's onions that are soaking in hydrogen peroxide. Here's a picture of those onions growing in greenhouse pots. And after a few weeks, they start to produce roots. And you can then get them to flower and set seed in the greenhouse and essentially complete their life cycle in 1 year. Now, that might not sound like much to you because you could say, well, it's still a year, but it sure beats 2 years. And this is a way to make breeding more efficient. And so in Chris's case, he was able to take the breeding life cycle and shorten it to 12 months. And it took some clever work and the very brilliant insight to learn how to soak the bulbs in hydrogen peroxide and chill them down. And this made it possible for us to go from seed to seed, that is to take a biennial plant and breed it in the span of 1 calendar year, which is what we do now. So those kinds of approaches help breeding because they shorten the time that it takes to do this very long, slow, protracted activity. So I want to bring my presentation to a close here by just sort of reiterating a few of the things that are important to our program. We spend a lot of time trying to improve the crop for a trait that's of value to a consumer or a farmer or a gardener or even a plant breeder. We try to increase the efficiency of the breeding techniques so that breeders can spend their time more efficiently, because let's face it, if it takes 10 years to breed a new variety, a person doesn't have very many of those 10-year periods in their career, right? So we want to make it as efficient as we can. We spend time training students, particularly those students who are going to go on to work in this field, who are going to go to the seed industry, who are going to work in agriculture on farms, who are going to be involved in biotechnology. These are people that are trained in our programs and hopefully can go on to do great things in the world. And of course, while they're here, they spend a lot of time creating new knowledge through their research. And so mentoring and supporting their research projects is a big part of what I do. And finally, we have a role in providing service to the industry, to farmers, to the state government, the federal government, and to consumers about vegetable crops, about their nutrition, about how to grow them, about how to breed them. This is all part of what we do within the scope of our work. And I'll just have one final slide here to say thanks to a whole number of supporters. And without the support of government agencies like the State Department of Ag or the USDA or industry groups like the Midwest Food Products Association, my work would not be possible. So I greatly appreciate the support of many different funding agencies and of course farmers as well. I have a picture of two of the farmers who we work closely with at TP Produce in Evansville, Wisconsin. This is they're pictured in the center of this slide, but I could just as likely show you multiple slides of many farmers across the state who have participated with us on research. Without those partnerships, the work that I talked about here wouldn't be possible. So let me bring this to a close, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about breeding and vegetables and any questions that you might have. And thank you so much for your attention.
Irwin, thanks so much. What a great presentation. And I know we're all just so itchy to get seeds in the garden. So great timing of your presentation.
Thank you.
We have a pretty active audience out here.
Wonderful.
Fran Paleo-Moyer, Badger Talks producer. So let's see, let's start with Susan English. And I'm not totally sure I understand her question, but she says, I should know this, but precise selection, as you mentioned, regarding increasing food supply, does that hybridize it and gen create sterile seeds?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So let's just sort of pick it apart. Hybridization is an ancient practice that people have been doing for thousands of years, which would be crossing plant A with plant B to make a better product for a farmer. So that, like a mule, for example, is a great example of a hybrid. A mule is an ancient technology, and people have been doing that for a very long time with crops. And we do that with carrots, we do that with beets, we do that with onions, we do that with corn, we do that with many of our crops. That's a traditional technique, and it does not involve genetic modification in any way. It's a classical technique. One of the ways that you make hybrids can be by making one of the parents sterile, and you do that so that the pollen doesn't contaminate the hybrid. And so it's not that the plant is sterile and that it is unable to produce seed. It's sterile so that the pollen from itself doesn't contaminate the hybrid that the farmer uses. And so I guess I would say to Susan that that's a very old and traditional technique for making hybrids that just allows for the production of a pure and uniform hybrid for a farmer to grow.
Great, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, Vince Husick asks, is there public access to this database of UW breeding program seeds and where to get them?
Great question, great question. You know, there is one conduit that everything goes through that you could try, Vince, and that would be the UW Plant Breeding and Plant Genetics program, sometimes called PBPG. And all of us who do plant breeding at the university are part of that program. And so one way you could, unfortunately, there's not an online database of all the varieties we've developed, but through the PBPG program, you could get access to who's breeding which crops, and then you could contact individuals. Well, let's see if I can, maybe Fran has a website for that.
Yeah, I see plantbreeding.wisstudy.edu. Is that the website?
There you go. That's the one.
So I will yep, I can post that in the chat.
Please put that in the chat. And that would be the best way. And so from there, you can see, okay, oh, here's somebody who's breeding alfalfa. I'll contact them. Or here's somebody who's doing cucumbers or melons. And then you can kind of go individually from there. I will also mention two entities that are carrying the seeds. One of them is the Wisconsin Crop Improvement Association. Wisconsin Crop Improvement Association carries some of the varieties that the breeders make, as does the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, or WARF. And so both of those entities can be contacted by anybody. And you could say, if you contacted WARF, you could say, hey, what carrots are available? And they'll tell you.
Oh, that's very interesting. Didn't know. On that same note, what happens to all of the crops that you produce?
Great question. So we grow acres and acres of crops to do our research. About 4 years ago, well, historically, we've given the excess produce away to Second Harvest, to food banks, to food pantries. But about 4 years ago, a group of students developed a program that is now called the Campus Food Shed. And essentially, it gathers research produce and it makes it available to the campus community. And it makes it all over Madison. And this is a food gathering program, a gleaning program, if you will, that has been really successful. And there are many other programs like that. So the produce that comes from these fields is used by people all around.
Wow, that's interesting. I never knew. Yeah. I will definitely be looking that one up. So. Let's see. Susan Wendt asks, how do we know if a variety was developed by UW?
You know, that is such an interesting question. Sometimes a seed catalog will indicate, it'll say plant breeders at the University of Wisconsin developed this. Sometimes it does not. And so one of the things that's so interesting about this is it's not always possible to attribute it to an individual. There are lists that are available online of all the vegetables that list every variety and try to list who the breeder is. So if the seed company doesn't tell you in the catalog, you can go to something called the vegetable cultivar list. Those are online, and you could look up, let's say there's a cucumber and you want to know, where did this come from? You can often find who developed that cucumber on that list. But I should say that the seed companies do and sometimes don't.
That's very interesting. Okay. Let's see. Pam Robbins posted, but then answered or found the answer to her question. She was looking for the spelling for this geosma.
Geosmin. Yeah, geosmin.
Geosmin. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe for the rest of the audience, could you?
Sure. It's GEO, like Earth, GEOSMIN, geosmin. And I think the literal translation of that word is earth scent. And one of the things that I didn't mention about this, Fran, but maybe it's worth saying to everybody who's listening, is that humans are more sensitive to geosmin than they are to almost any other scent. We can detect it at extremely low levels in the environment. And I think the smell of soil and the smell of rain, these are geosmin, and it must be somehow very deeply related to our history as humans, but we really can pick it up, which is, I think, one of the reasons why people are sensitive to it in their foods.
That's so funny. I actually did a taste test in our family, and everybody tastes beets differently. I don't taste the earthiness, you know.
Oh, you don't taste it?
Yeah. I don't. Love them. Tastes like candy to me.
See, and that's so interesting. I'm sure that people vary hugely in their sensitivities, That's a great example.
Yeah. So Dave Wagner's asking, has the pandemic affected working with your collaborators in other parts of the world?
Oh, yeah. And if this is the Dave that I know, Dave, it's so nice to hear from you. Thank you for listening. Yes, the pandemic has had a huge impact on our research programs. Everything from the field days that we depend on. So we normally will have a field day where we'll get together with other plant breeders and farmers and talk about the crop and talk about the different strains we're breeding. Those are so important for us, and those have been they were gone all last year. Even to things like as simple as going to the field to do our work, we were limited to having one person per vehicle, and of course having to be spaced out in the field. All of that had a huge impact on our ability to do our work. That said, when I think about it now, I think it's amazing that we did as much as we did. And I think this is true not just for our program, but for many plant breeding programs, they were able to continue their work. They figured out ways. They spent longer hours. I mean, if you normally you do a job that takes 10 people, hard physical work that they're doing all together, it might take you, if you had to do it by yourself or with one other person, it might take you a much longer time. But we managed to get through, and we're planning on a much more normal season in 21. So hopefully that was an anomaly, but it's been a tough year.
That's great to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Dave Wegner just commented, yes, miss you guys. Just
oh, thank you.
Let's see. Evan Schnatt comments, there is a lot of excitement around regenerative agriculture and nutrient density. What is genetic selection currently doing in this area? Is it a nice idea yet, or is there some practical application?
That's such a great area. Yeah, regenerative agriculture, which is for those who aren't familiar, is not only organic in the way that the practice, it's an organic agriculture practice, but it also takes into account issues like labor and fair labor. It takes into account the health of the soil and the quality of the soil. So it has so many wonderful things going for it. And I'm happy to say that plant breeders are now working in those environments. So 20 years ago, it was rare for a plant breeder to be selecting to make a new variety that worked well in an organic system. Now, routinely, many plant breeders work. I have, I think, 3 organic locations this year where I'm doing my plant breeding on an organic farm. And some of those farms also do regenerative practices as well. So increasingly, what we're seeing in the breeding community is they're embracing regenerative practices, embracing organics, and more than that, breeding varieties that are specifically adapted to those conditions. That's what's been missing. And because everything that we had bred was for conventional environments. And so I think this is a vanguard of plant breeding.
Great, thanks for that answer. Let's see, Ulrich Dieterle is commenting out on our YouTube channel. How long did it take to develop the current, oh no, you answered that one, sorry, and he said that. The other question, can I get Badger Flame beet seeds locally? I've ordered them for 2 years from row 7, but would love to get them here.
Yes, there's only a few companies that are selling them right now nationally. And so there is not, as far as I know, any Wisconsin supplier. But if you contact me, outside of this Badger Talks Live, Ulrich, I think your name was Ulrich. If you do that, maybe we can find a way for you to get some seed here and be able to grow some this year, because I'd love to be able to get it in your hands. The way the distribution works is a little bit outside of my control, the way the seed industry handles it, but maybe there's a way that we can get some. So please just email me if you could.
That's great. And you can just email badgertalks@wisc.edu and we can forward your questions to Irwin.
Mm-hmm.
Also mentions, I had a fairly low germination rate with the Badger Flame beets. Can you give me some hints on improving that?
Yeah, that's, one of the big flaws of that variety, and I'm not proud of this, is that most of the yellow beets, most of the golden beets, have poorer seed quality and lower germ. And in my opinion, this comes from their parentage, which to a great extent, the main yellow variety that was available in the market for a long time was Burpee's Golden. And Burpee's Golden had poor germination and poor seed quality. And I used Burpee's Golden as one of the parents in breeding Badger Flame. So unfortunately, I have been unable to get away from some of that trait. One of the things that some gardeners are doing is transplanting, growing beets and then doing beet transplants. And I have found that to be a good way to go. But it is one of the characteristics that I must improve on my next version of Badger Flame. So thanks for mentioning that.
Well, Irwin Goldman, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your important work with us. It obviously touches almost everybody in some way. So thank you for that. And I'm extremely happy to know that you're going to be continuing the practice until you are a ripe old woman.
I think that's what I'll look like. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks again. Glad to
Thank
have
you, Fran. It was a pleasure.
Everybody, please tune in next Tuesday, April 13th at noon, and we're going to be welcoming Extension Program Manager Angela Flickinger, who's going to be talking about the Wisconsin Strong Bodies program. If you're not familiar with it, that program is a community-based strength training program, and there are meeting groups all over the state. So tune in to find out how you can participate and find a local group. As always, visit badgertalks.wis.edu where you can see the upcoming schedule of talks. You can sign up for our email list to learn about future programming. Please consider a donation as we are supported by a grant from the Alumni Association. And you can certainly sign up to host your own speaker for any upcoming events. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next week.